I spent my life pretending he was just a patient. But in truth, he was the secret I never had the courage to confess. And what I discovered years later, forever, changed everything I thought I knew about that man. My name is Mavis June Nakano. I have 85 years old, and I live alone in a small house in Fresno, California. Here, silence isn't just an absence of sound. It's an echo that echoes off the walls, mixed with the faint scent of jasmine tea and the soft creak of the tatami mat beneath my feet. Mornings arrive slowly, illuminating the bonsai in the corner of the room, and nights stretch on as if waiting for something that will never return. I often spend my afternoons tidying up little things that don't need tidying, perhaps to avoid facing the memories that still hang heavy in the air. I joined the war when I was just 20 years old, hastily trained as a field nurse. I was sent to a makeshift hospital just a few miles from the front line, where the air always smelled of disinfectant mixed with smoke, and the thin walls let in the distant, but constant, sound of explosions. It was a place where every face bore the weight of urgency, and where I believed my job was to save lives, not keep secrets. Back then, I was a thin young woman in an impeccable uniform, with steady hands and a gaze trained to not flinch in the face of pain. Today, I am a woman bent by time, with wrinkles that hold more stories than my words could ever tell. And it is in this distance between the Mavis of yesterday and the one of today that his memory lives on. The one I insisted for decades on calling simply patient. If you also believe that certain stories can only be told in the silence of the years. Subscribe here. Each video is a memory that was almost lost. The stuffy ward of the field hospital seemed smaller by the day. It wasn't just the stifling heat that gathered beneath the low ceiling, nor the constant smell of ether mixed with sweat, blood, and smoke that seemed to permeate even the fabric of uniforms. It was the way the bodies piled up on the narrow beds, the proximity between life and death, and the invisible weight hanging over us all. Every step I took between beds was calculated, taking pulses, changing gauze, adjusting IVs, recording progress. It was routine. It was work. It was survival. That day my mind was trained not to dwell any longer than necessary. I had learned that, in war, clinging to a patient could be an unbearable burden when the news we all dreaded arrived. But still, something made me pause. It was an almost imperceptible detail, the way a soldier, at the back of the ward, was positioned. He didn't move much, and yet he seemed to focus all his attention on a distant point, beyond the window covered by a thick cloth, placed there to contain the light and perhaps prevent the outside world from invading that fragile space. He wasn't looking at me. He didn't even seem to notice my presence. His gaze was fixed somewhere that didn't exist at that moment, as if he were waiting for someone who would never arrive. It was a look I recognized. I'd seen it on mothers receiving sealed letters, on soldiers waking to discover they were the last survivors of their units. A mix of hope and resignation, as if he knew time was about to run out and yet refused to close it completely. I approached with the same neutral expression I wore with everyone. My uniform was my shield, and the clipboard in my hand, my excuse not to bond. I placed my fingers on his pulse and counted the heartbeat. It was steady, but slower than expected. I adjusted an already adjusted pillow, lightly touching the bandage just to give myself a few more seconds by his side. It was unprofessional to do so, and I knew it. But something about that stillness held me captive. The field hospital was no place for long observations. All around, other soldiers groaned, calling for mothers or wives, and life hurried by, trying not to get lost. But with him, it seemed as if time stretched out. His breathing was calm, as if he wanted to lengthen each second. I found myself wondering who he was waiting for, what story he carried in his eyes, and why, of all those there, he was the only one who made me forget, for a few minutes, the hustle and bustle around me. There was no exchange of words in that first moment, just a silent awareness, me watching him, and he, perhaps aware of my presence but unresponsive. This silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if he were telling me, without speaking, that there was more to this story than I could ever record in the medical record. When I walked away, I went back to work as if nothing had happened. I tended to other beds, changed dressings and jotted down numbers, but deep down, I knew something had shifted inside me. I still had no idea how much that first glance, which wasn't even meant for me, would change everything. I only knew he wasn't just another patient. And although my training told me to forget, my memory had already decided to keep him. That night, the dim light of kerosene lamps flickered over the registration desks. The distant sound of explosions marked time like a macabre clock, and the yellowed paper felt rougher under my tired fingers. It was my daily routine, confirming patient identification, reviewing medical notes, and recording progress. Each file was like an anchor, a piece of identity we tried to preserve so that, if the worst happened, someone, somewhere, would know who was gone. But when I looked up his record, I found only a number. There was no name, age, or unit of origin. The number was even scratched out with a pen that had left a deep mark on the paper, as if someone had made a point of erasing every trace. In the bottom corner, in small dry letters, it simply read, "Transferred without date." That made me uneasy. Unidentified patients always came with stories no one wanted to tell, and in that war, I had already learned that some lives were treated as administrative problems. The less information, the easier it is to forget. I ran my fingers over the pen mark, trying to guess which numbers had been erased. It was a futile, almost childish gesture, but I couldn't help it. Back then, every detail felt like a clue, and I clung to them as if they could give me a map of where I was standing. I tried to get answers from one of the orderlies. I casually asked if anyone had arrived unregistered that day. He looked around before replying, "Don't ask about him, Mavis. It's better this way." That sentence, spoken almost in a whisper, only heightened my curiosity. This wasn't just any casualty. Back in the ward, I watched him sleep. His face was serene, but there were subtle marks, a slight bruise on his head, subtle scratches on his neck, that didn't match the combat wounds I was used to seeing. They seemed like signs of something that had happened before, perhaps even far from the battlefield. I wondered if he was there by chance, or if someone had decided to place him in this particular hospital to keep him out of sight. I remembered a previous case, months earlier, in which a soldier was admitted without registration, kept in isolation, and then disappeared in the dead of night. Days later, I heard that he had been taken for questioning and never returned. The blankness in his file seemed a harbinger of the same fate. As I checked his vital signs, I felt a kind of unease, as if I were helping to conceal a crime without being invited into the plot. At the same time, an inner voice insisted that there was something about him that deserved to be known, preserved, remembered. It wasn't just the mystery of the erased record. It was the feeling that if I didn't know who he was, no one would. I returned to the registration desk later, when the ward was quieter. I made minimal notes, just enough to keep him under my care without drawing attention. I wrote something I don't usually write in the observations field. Patient calm, gaze fixed, breathing regular. It wouldn't seem like much to a regular reader, but to me it was a way of recording his existence, not just as a wounded body, but as someone who had somehow already inscribed himself in my memory. As I closed the file, I felt a chill that wasn't coming from the cold. In war, Not knowing someone's name could be an act of protection or a sentence. And I still didn't know which one he was being held under. For the first few days, the silence between us was so thick, it felt like a third character in the room. He didn't call me by name. And in fact, he didn't call anyone. When I approached to change his bandage or check his IV, he simply watched me, unhurriedly, as if considering whether it was worth breaking a vow he'd made to himself. There was no hostility in his gaze, but there was no surrender either. It was neutral, almost ceremonial ground, where every gesture seemed charged with an intention I didn't yet understand. The fourth day was different. I had just adjusted the pillow under his head, pulling the blanket slightly to better cover his shoulder, when he spoke. And it wasn't a question, nor a request. In a low, almost scratchy voice, he said, "You don't need to feel sorry for me." The phrase wasn't meant as an accusation. On the contrary, there was a hint of tenderness in it that caught me off guard. I continued fidgeting with the sheet, as if I hadn't heard correctly. But inside, something stirred. It wasn't common for wounded patients to care about what I was feeling. In war, one's pain is often the center of one's world. But he, somehow, was looking outside himself. I responded with only a slight nod, avoiding prolonging the conversation. Not out of disinterest, but because I knew that if I spoke it might open the door to questions I might not want to hear. However, in the following days I noticed that he began to follow my movements with his eyes, as if studying my habits. He noticed when I approached from the left or right, when I took longer with a bandage, or when I took a deep breath before touching a wound. I also began to notice little things about him. He didn't sleep deeply, even at night. Sometimes he'd open his eyes suddenly, as if waking from an unpleasant dream, and would lie there, staring at the ceiling, until sleep returned. When another patient cried out in pain, he'd close his eyes tightly, but not in compassion. It seemed more like the reflex of someone hearing something they'd heard many times before, and would rather forget. One rainy morning while I was changing his IV, he murmured, "You listen too much." I was confused. I asked what he meant, and he replied, "I can see you keep everything to yourself. What you hear, what you see. You shouldn't. It'll weigh on you later." At that moment, I understood that, somehow, he was reading me as I was reading him. I don't know if it was a warning or a confession. I only know that the phrase echoed, as if he'd seen a portrait of me years from now, with a more stooped body and heavier eyes, carrying stories I'd told no one. The silence that returned after that was no longer the same. It wasn't empty. It was charged. He had given me a fragment of himself, and that changed the way I approached him. He was no longer just a nameless patient. He was a man who perceived too much, who said too little, and who, in some way, was preparing me for something yet to come. When I left that ward that afternoon, I realized I'd written down less information about him than usual. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I understood that sometimes keeping something on paper is the only way to keep it alive. In war, we learn to care without getting too close. Touch is technical, firm to hold an arm, precise to bandage a wound, quick to adjust a catheter. It's a functional, almost mechanical gesture, because true closeness can become dangerous, for both the patient and the caregiver. The manual didn't say it in words, but we knew. Clinging meant suffering twice over when the inevitable happened. With him, however, the barrier began to crumble. It was late afternoon, and the air inside the ward was heavier than usual. The generator had failed, and the heat accumulated as if the tarp covering the ceiling were a lid over us. He lay there, eyes half closed, breathing slowly. I reached over to change the bandage on his leg, and as I held his knee to steady it, I felt him not flinch. On the contrary, He relaxed under my touch. I held the gauze roll closer, trying to maintain a professional tone, but I noticed his hand, resting on the sheet, open slightly, like an involuntary invitation. For a moment I hesitated. I knew it wasn't right. The rules were clear. Avoid unnecessary physical contact. But there was something in that silent gesture that disarmed me. Without much thought, I touched his hand. It was light, almost a brush of fingers. I don't know if it was he who squeezed first or I, but before I knew it, our hands were intertwined. The warmth of his skin penetrated my defenses, and in that instant I forgot I was in uniform. There was no sound of bombs, no wounded moaning in the background. Just that discreet grip, as if we were saying to each other, "I see you. I know you're here." We stayed like that for a few seconds that felt much longer. I could feel his pulse, rhythmic and steady, and I wondered if he could feel mine quickening. We didn't exchange words, but there was a silent dialogue going on there, a recognition that went beyond names or shared stories. When I finally let go of his hand to return to the bandage, he opened his eyes and looked at me in a way that made me feel exposed. It wasn't a look of gratitude, nor of curiosity. It was as if to say, "Now you're already involved." I continued my work as if nothing had happened, but the feeling stayed with me. As I left the ward, the night wind hit me hard, bringing the smell of rain and gunpowder. I took a deep breath, trying to regain the distance I had lost, but deep down, I knew it was no longer possible. From that day on, whenever I passed by his bedside, I felt the memory of that touch and the need to avoid repeating it, precisely because I knew how much it meant. It was dangerous not only because of the war, but because it was opening a door that could not be closed. Perhaps, in the end, all forbidden love begins like this, not with declarations, not with promises, but with a brief touch, hidden in the middle of a field where nothing is safe. It was dawn when I noticed his eyes held a weight that didn't just come from physical pain. The ward was nearly silent, just the sound of an IV drip, an occasional moan in the background, and the light rain pattering on the window pane. I was walking slowly, checking on the patients, when I noticed he was awake, staring at the ceiling as if reading something invisible. I approached to change the dressing. The wound on his leg still required daily care, and although he rarely complained, I knew the procedure was painful. I sat down beside him and began the work in silence. It was then that he spoke, without looking at me. "Have you ever lied for love?" The question caught me off guard. Conversations like this weren't common in the hospital, and if they did happen, they were almost always filled with quick confessions before the fever spiked. I tried to keep my tone neutral. "Not that I remember," I replied. He closed his eyes for a second and added, "I'm here because of a lie, but I wasn't the one who told it." The sentence hung in the air, like an open wound he had no intention of explaining. I continued changing the bandage, but my fingers tightened, as if that piece of information were flammable. I didn't ask any more, partly out of caution, partly out of fear of what I might hear. But as I looked at him, I noticed something in his eyes that clashed with the calm expression on his face. It was as if a shadow was moving within, a mixture of regret and loyalty to something that couldn't be revealed. For the rest of the night I passed by his bed a few times. He was always awake, and he always looked away when he noticed me watching. It was as if he feared getting involved in whatever that secret was, and at the same time he wanted me to know it existed. In war, I learned that some questions shouldn't be asked, not because there's no answer, but because the answer can change the way you look at someone. At that moment, I felt that if I knew the whole truth, I might not be able to care for him with the same detachment. But there was something magnetic about that mystery. Every time I saw it, I tried to guess what lie could have put a man there. wounded, nameless, and with his records erased. Was it desertion, a mission error, or something much more personal, involving someone he was trying to protect? I remembered how his eyes had watched me the day I'd touched his hand. It wasn't just physical proximity. It was as if he were testing me, trying to see if I could carry a weight that wasn't mine. And though I didn't say anything, I already knew the answer. Yes, I would. When I finished the dressing, he murmured, almost imperceptibly, "Sometimes surviving is the punishment." I don't know if he was talking about himself or someone else, but when our eyes met, I realized there wasn't just pain there. There was also a silent pact. A pact I hadn't consciously accepted, but somehow already sealed. It was a few days after that silent dawn that he asked me. The hospital was especially busy that afternoon. We'd received a trainload of wounded, and the ward was overwhelmed with groans, rapid-fire orders, and the suffocating smell of fresh blood mixed with disinfectant. I moved from bed to bed, trying to remain calm as the tension rose in the air. When I reached him, I noticed he was more alert than usual. His eyes weren't wandering the ceiling or fixed on the window. They were fixed on me, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. I leaned over to check the IV, and that's when he whispered, "I need you to do something for me." The tone of his voice wasn't pleading, nor was it the usual urgency. It was controlled, as if he were measuring each word. I glanced around to make sure no one was paying attention, and murmured, "What is it?" He looked away for a moment, as if calculating whether I was worth trusting, and then he said, "I want you to deliver a letter." At first, it didn't seem that dangerous. Soldiers often asked him to send notes or messages, but he continued, "It's for someone outside the camp. You can't give it to anyone here. It has to be you." Those words made my stomach churn. War taught us to be suspicious of anything that escaped official channels. Any unrecorded communication could be interpreted as espionage, desertion, or treason. I knew this, and so did he. "You know that's forbidden," I replied, keeping my tone low. He nodded. "I know, but it's not just my life that depends on it." The sentence echoed in my head. I didn't ask who else was involved. Maybe because if I knew, it would be even harder to say no. I looked at him and noticed something almost resigned in his expression. It didn't seem like a request made on impulse. It was more like he'd bided his time and chosen the person who could carry the burden. "If they catch me," I began to say. "I know." He interrupted me without looking away. "But if you don't, something much worse will happen." He didn't explain what this worst meant. He just went back to staring at the ceiling, as if the conversation were over. I stood there, motionless for a few seconds, feeling the weight of the dilemma settle in. It was more than breaking a rule. It was putting my life, my position, and my safety at risk, for a man whose name I didn't even know. I returned to work in that ward, trying to ignore the lump in my throat. But every time I passed him, I felt as if the request was throbbing between us, invisible, but impossible to ignore. I knew that if I said no, I would be choosing the safest path. But I also knew I wouldn't be able to look at him the same way afterward. That night, before ending my shift, I returned to his bedside. He was awake, as if waiting for me. He didn't say anything when I approached, just slid a small folded envelope to the edge of the bed. I took it without looking, and he closed his eyes as if finally able to breathe. I knew from that moment on, there was no turning back. Carrying that letter was like carrying a sentence, for him, for me, or for both. I carried the envelope to my quarters like someone carrying something that might explode at any moment. It was small, discreet, with no visible sender, but the paper was slightly wrinkled, as if it had been handled more often than it should have been. I spent much of the night with it in my uniform pocket, feeling its weight belied by its size. In my mind, I tried to imagine the contents. Perhaps it was for a woman, wife, fiancé, lover. Some urgent farewell, a plea for forgiveness, or even a confession of a hidden love. These were the most common hypotheses. I could even understand how a wounded man, nameless and with his records erased, would try to say goodbye to the one he loved before it was too late. But at dawn, when I finally summoned the courage to take a look, the shock was immediate. In the top corner of the envelope, the recipient's name was written in bold letters, Captain Elias Whitmore. I knew that name. It belonged to an officer on the other side of the battle line. Technically, an enemy. My blood ran cold. The letter wasn't just personal. It was dangerous. It could be interpreted as collaboration with the enemy, espionage, or, worse yet, treason. I quickly closed the envelope, as if simply looking at it would incriminate me. I thought about returning it, going to him and telling him I couldn't do it. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of the way he'd looked at me when I'd put the envelope in my pocket. It wasn't a normal pleading look. It was deeper, as if he were entrusting me with something he already knew could destroy me. And yet, he'd chosen me for this mission. The day passed in a haze. I cared for the other patients automatically, while the envelope seemed to burn against my body. Every time an officer passed by, my heart raced, afraid someone would notice. Every time I glanced at him, at the back of the ward, he maintained the same serene expression, as if nothing were happening. That night, when the hallways were emptier, I picked up the envelope and turned it over in my fingers. I wondered who this Captain Whitmore was. A friend? A savior? Or someone who knew too much? And most importantly, why did he need this letter delivered right now, when he was wounded and vulnerable? In the end, I tucked the envelope away in the back of my drawer, wrapped in a handkerchief. I didn't yet know how or when I would deliver it, but I had already decided I wouldn't let it disappear. Something inside me told me that, even without understanding the full context, this letter held more than words. It held the key to understanding who he really was. The next morning, he didn't ask me about the letter. He didn't press. He didn't make any gestures or signs. He just looked at me for a moment as I passed, and that moment was enough for me to know that, somehow, he already knew the answer. I would deliver it. I didn't know it yet, but this decision would be the breaking point between the life I had, until then, and the life that awaited me afterwards. It was the day after the letter that everything seemed to change between us, even without words. I walked through the ward, checking on patients, but with him it was different. Every time I approached, there was a space of silence that didn't need to be filled. It was as if everything we couldn't say was suspended in the air, waiting for a right moment that might never come. That afternoon, the rain pounded hard against the tarp, muffling the sound of footsteps and conversations around them. The light was softer, almost golden, filtering in from the side through the makeshift window opening. He sat with his legs stretched out, a thin blanket draped over his shoulders. For the first time, he didn't seem like a patient, but a man simply existing in time, with a presence that occupied more space than the physical. I went to change his bandage, but I realized I'd been putting off touching him. Our hands met as I adjusted the IV pole, and he didn't flinch. On the contrary, his fingers brushed mine, a gesture brief but charged with something that made me hold my breath. I felt the urge to maintain contact, but I backed away, as if knowing that one more step could bring down an entire wall. As I worked, he watched me, not with the coldness of someone evaluating, but with the attention of someone recording every detail for later. It felt like he was leaving without warning. When I finished bandaging him, our hands fell together, resting on the sheet. It was instinctive. We leaned in slightly. The slightest movement would be enough for our lips to meet. The air between us seemed thicker, the sound of the rain more distant, as if the world had shrunk to make room for just that moment. But he turned his face away, not abruptly, nor as if repenting, but with an almost painful gentleness, as if to say, "We can't." I stood still for a few seconds, feeling the weight of what hadn't happened. There was no frustration in the usual sense. It wasn't interrupted desire. It was something deeper, as if that non-kiss held more meaning than the act itself. I returned to my post with the feeling that something had been broken and, at the same time, preserved. Sometimes what doesn't happen maintains a purity that concrete facts can't sustain. If our lips had met, perhaps that moment would have become a shared memory, one among so many that war swallows. But then it became untouchable. In the days that followed, I realized we avoided getting so close again. It wasn't for lack of desire. It was for fear of ruining what wasn't meant to be. The silence between us changed tone. It was no longer one of distrust, nor of expectation. It was one of caution, as if we both knew that by not crossing that line, we were protecting something that war couldn't destroy. And yet, part of me wondered what it would have been like if we hadn't hesitated. The morning began like any other. The smell of weak coffee wafting from the makeshift kitchen, hurried footsteps in the hallway, and the metallic sound of instruments being sterilized. I was in the cafeteria scribbling brief notes about the patient's progress, when two voices caught my attention. They were officers, speaking softly, but with that tone that didn't need to be loud to be heard. Gravity carried the sound to me. "He's being transferred tomorrow, with no return," one of them said. The answer came dryly. "It's already decided. There's no negotiation." I pretended to keep writing, but my hand was shaking slightly. I knew that when someone was transferred, without return, it didn't just mean they went to another hospital. It was a euphemism for disappearance, maybe to a prison camp, maybe to something worse. They didn't say his name, but I didn't need to ask. It was him. The rest of the day was a blur. I passed by his bedside a few times, but I couldn't say anything. He seemed too calm, as if he already knew. His serenity only increased my despair. How could anyone accept their fate like that? Part of me wanted to shake him, demand he react, ask for help, run. But the other part knew that if he had already made peace with what was to come, nothing I said would change that. For the next few hours, I wondered where this order had come from. Was it because of the letter? Because of the name erased from the file? Or was there something I didn't yet know? Each hypothesis gnawed at me more. That night, while changing his bandage, I almost blurted out the question, "Do you know where you're going?" But I held back. He looked at me, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something. Instead, he just smiled in a way that hurt more than any answer. It wasn't a smile of comfort. It was a smile of farewell. After work, I sat in my dorm, the letter still hidden among my things. The rain was beating down on the roof, and I was trying to decide whether to try to deliver it that night. But what if that was what had caused the transfer? What if I got caught and ended up unable to help him at all? In war, we learned to live with silence. But that silence, that night, had a bitter metallic taste, as if every minute that passed robbed me of the chance to change something. The thought that, the next morning, he would no longer be there, and that I would have no control over that, made me feel powerless in a way no other situation had. I lay awake for hours, reliving every moment with him. The touch of his hand, the non-kiss, the unanswered questions, and above all, that feeling that there was so much more behind his presence in that hospital than I would ever know. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of his bedside window open, the cloth flapping in the wind, and the empty space where he should have been. I woke with the certainty that this dream would come true before the sun set again. I knew from the moment I heard those officers that this would be our last night, and perhaps that's why I spent the entire day inventing reasons to be near him. I collected trays earlier than necessary, offered to check vital signs more frequently, and arranged a pillow that didn't need to be adjusted. Every gesture was an excuse not to waste the little time we had left. As night fell, the ward was quieter than usual. The light rain had stopped, and the air seemed suspended, as if even the weather were waiting for something. I was standing by the door, pretending to organize a dressing cart, when a colleague told me I could go rest. I nodded but didn't move. I waited until he left, then walked to his bed. He wasn't surprised. He was awake, leaning lightly on his elbow, as if he'd known I was coming. The dim light from the lamp cast soft shadows on his face, highlighting every line I'd come to know so well. There was no greeting or explanation. I simply sat in the chair next to him and remained silent. "I know," he said finally. "Tomorrow." I didn't need to ask what he meant. I just lowered my eyes, feeling the weight of the word without return. He continued, "If you remind me, that's enough." The sentence pierced me. I thought of everything I wanted to say, that I didn't understand why this was happening, that I wanted to know the truth, that I wanted more time. But the words stuck. Instead, I placed my hand over his, repeating the gesture that had previously broken down our barriers. He squeezed lightly, and we stayed like that for minutes I couldn't count. As the silence enveloped us, I realized I was recording every detail. The slow sound of his breathing, the rough texture of the blanket, the flickering golden light dancing on the wall. I wanted something to take with me, something that would withstand the emptiness I knew would come. Later, when the rest of the ward was asleep, I offered to change his bandage, not because it was necessary, but because I wanted one last excuse to touch him. He didn't say anything, just watched me, and in that look, there was a kind of acceptance that hurt more than fear. When I finished, I couldn't leave immediately. I rested my chin on my hand, staring at him like someone trying to memorize a face before a long winter. He smiled slightly, and that smile, so restrained, seemed to carry more words than any conversation we'd ever had. I don't remember saying goodnight. I think I stayed there until the first hint of light penetrated the canvas, and it was only when I heard footsteps in the hallway that I got up. He looked at me one last time, and that look stayed with me, stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. I knew that when I returned, the bed would be empty. The next morning I arrived earlier than usual. The hallway was cold, and the air seemed charged with a strange silence, unlike what we knew. There was no murmur of low voices, no clang of trays being prepared. Everything seemed still. When I entered the ward, my gaze went straight to the corner where he used to be. The bed was made, the sheets impeccably straightened, as if no one had slept there. The pillow still had a deep crease, but there was nothing else to indicate a man had occupied the space hours before. No hanging files, no personal belongings. My first impulse was to look around, expecting to see him on a nearby stretcher, perhaps awaiting transport. But he wasn't there. Not in the hallways, not in the procedure room. It was as if he'd vanished overnight. I went to the main ward and asked, trying to sound casual, if they'd done any patient transfers overnight. The nurse who attended to me just looked up for a second, as if gauging what she could tell me, and then replied, "I don't have that information." That phrase was an old familiar disguise for, "Don't ask anymore." I returned to the ward and stood for a few minutes before the empty bed. I remembered every detail of the previous night, the clasped hands, the request for me to remember him. The space felt colder than the rest of the room, as if his absence had sapped some of the air's temperature. While changing another patient's IV, I heard 2 soldiers talking quietly. They took a wounded man to the forward base to the north. Yes, but he won't come back. They didn't say names, but I knew. I thought about the letter hidden in my drawer. It sat there, still folded and intact, like a silent, heavy presence. I didn't know if its absence meant I should deliver it immediately, or if that had now become impossible. Every hour that passed without a decision deepened the feeling that I was failing him and myself. I spent the rest of the shift on autopilot, but every time I looked at that empty corner, I felt a tightness in my chest. It was as if the world had decided to erase not only his body from that place, but also any evidence that he had ever been there. By the time the sun began to set, the crease in the pillow was barely noticeable. And the next day, the bed was occupied by another soldier, with a different story, a different pain. War leaves no room for prolonged absences. Everything must go on, even if for some of us time has stopped. At that moment, I realized there would be no goodbye. There would be no body to mourn, no final word. Just that heavy silence, made of unanswered questions and an emptiness that no one but me seemed to notice. I knew that for everyone else he had already ceased to exist. But for me, his disappearance wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a weight I would carry for the rest of my life. After he disappeared, I discovered something I already knew, but had never felt so strongly. War doesn't stop to mourn anyone. No matter the weight of absence, no matter if someone left an empty space impossible to fill. The next wounded arrives. The next order is given. The next day begins. In the days that followed, his bed was occupied by another soldier, this one with a full name and history. I treated him with the same dedication I treated everyone, but I couldn't help but make the silent comparison. As I checked the new patient's pulse, my mind still searched for the slow, controlled breathing of the man who was no longer there. The routine returned to its usual rhythm, though to me everything seemed out of place. The familiar sounds, hurried footsteps, the clanging of instruments, the murmur of conversation now seemed louder, more invasive, as if trying to push out the memory I refused to let go of. Sometimes, in the middle of work, I'd catch myself looking toward the back of the ward, hoping for just a moment to see him there. Not like a ghost, but like someone who, by some miracle, had escaped the fate imposed upon him. And when I realized he wasn't there, I felt a kind of nausea, as if my body were still waiting for a reunion that reason knew was impossible. The letter remained at the bottom of my drawer, wrapped in the same scarf I'd used to hide it. It was the only tangible link I had left with him. I didn't know if delivering that letter would mean fulfilling my silent promise, or condemning someone, perhaps even myself, but I couldn't get rid of it either. It was as if burning or tearing up that envelope would erase the last trace of his existence. At times, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. After all, patients disappeared all the time in war. But it wasn't the same. He wasn't just another wounded body that passed through my hands. There was something in the way he looked at me, the way he avoided saying certain things and yet still left a trace. It was as if he'd planted a question inside me and left before I could hear the answer. The following months were a succession of identical days, but each carried his shadow. Sometimes, between appointments, I would close my eyes and remember our last night. It was like revisiting a photograph that only exists in my mind. The flickering light, the touch of hands, the silence that said more than words. The war ended for some, changed its face for others. But for me, at that point, it had already taken on the shape of him, of what was left unsaid, of what didn't happen, of what was never explained. And even when other faces passed through my life, even when I returned home and the sound of bombs faded, he remained there, occupying a space that nothing and no one could erase. The war continued without him, but inside me, nothing remained the same. It took more than 20 years for me to see him again, or at least for my eyes to believe they were seeing him. By then I had left the field hospitals behind. I worked in a small community clinic and led a discreet, almost anonymous life. The war had become a set of fragmented memories, which I kept silent. It was at a veterans fair, a local event that brought together veterans and professionals who served during the toughest years. I hadn't planned to go, but a former colleague insisted. She said it could be therapeutic to see familiar faces. I didn't expect one of those faces to be his. I was walking among the stalls, looking at old medals and faded photographs, when I saw him. He was standing at a table with historical documents, talking to a younger man. His hair was gray now, his body heavier, but his posture was exactly the same. And when he turned around, my heart raced. I stood still, watching from afar, trying to be sure. The contours of his face, the way he squinted when he heard something, there was no doubt it was him. I gathered my courage and approached slowly, as if walking on thin ice. When I was just a few steps away, he looked in my direction. My whole body waited for recognition, a flash, a sign in his eyes, anything that told me he remembered too. But it didn't come. His gaze passed over me as if I were just another stranger in the crowd. I tried to speak. I called his name, or rather, the name I knew, the one other soldiers had said, never him. He frowned in confusion and politely replied that he must be mistaking me. His tone was cordial but impersonal, as if there were nothing in the past that connected us. I wanted to believe I was mistaken, that maybe it was just someone who looked similar. But there was one detail that crushed my doubt, a small scar just above my left eyebrow, in the exact spot where I had cleaned a wound years before. I didn't insist. I felt that any attempt to force that reunion would be like violating an invisible pact. He said goodbye with a cold handshake and returned to his conversation with the other man. I walked away, feeling an emptiness so great it felt like a hole had been ripped open inside my chest. As I walked through the market, I remembered everything. The touch of hands, the non-kiss, the request to deliver the letter. The memory didn't hurt because of absence. It hurt because of erasure. It was as if I'd been removed from the history we shared, as if for him, I'd never existed. I spent the rest of the event in silence, avoiding reunions and conversations. When I got home, I took the envelope out of the drawer where it was still stored. I looked at the name written on it and wondered if he remembered what was inside, or, worse yet, if he wanted to forget. And it was that night that I realized something cruel. Sometimes, forgetting is not an accident. It is a choice. A few months after that cold reunion, I received an unexpected call from an old war buddy, Margaret, a retired nurse who had served at another base in the final years of the conflict. Her voice was more fragile than I remembered, but still carried the firmness she used to keep patients and doctors in line. "Mavis, I've been organizing my wartime diaries. I think I have something that belongs to you," she said bluntly. I went to her house that same afternoon. Margaret lived in a small apartment filled with books and boxes, stacked with old papers. She led me into the living room and placed a weather-beaten envelope on the table. My heart raced. It wasn't the same one I'd hidden, but there was something unsettling about the way she held it. "Do you remember a patient with no record? A man who disappeared without explanation?" he asked, looking me straight in the eye. I could only nod. Margaret sighed. I saw him months after he left our hospital. He was on another base, under a different name, and what's more, it was the letter you delivered that saved his life. My entire body went still. I didn't deliver the letter, I replied almost in a whisper. She arched her eyebrows. So someone did it for you. Maybe himself. I don't know how, but it reached the recipient. I asked who the recipient was, even though I already knew the answer. Captain Elias Whitmore, he confirmed. He had connections influential enough to clear someone's name and create a new one. Margaret told me that, from what she had heard, the man was not a traitor, as some believed, but rather at the center of a political military scandal that could have cost lives and reputations. The letter contained enough evidence, or perhaps promises, to secure his freedom and a new identity in another country. As she spoke, my mind returned to the veteran's fare, his blank stare, his impersonal handshake. It wasn't accidental forgetfulness. It was survival. Perhaps by denying me recognition, he was protecting me from a past that could still be dangerous. Or perhaps he was protecting himself from remembering. Margaret then pulled an old photograph from a folder. In it, he was standing next to Captain Whitmore, both smiling, free, in a place I didn't recognize. There was peace on his face, but also a subtle heaviness in his eyes, as if part of him was still looking back. I returned home with the photo in my hands. Upon arriving, I opened the drawer and took out the letter I'd kept at all those years. I'd never had the courage to open it, and at that moment, I realized that perhaps it was for the best. The contents had already served their purpose in the world, and reading them now would merely satisfy a curiosity that wouldn't change anything. I sat at the table, the letter on one side, and the photograph on the other, and I understood with a silent pain that I would never be a part of his life that came after. But I also understood something deeper. My presence, however brief, had helped save that life. And somehow, that had to be enough. Today, at 85, I realized that time doesn't erase certain stories. It only makes them more silent. Life went on, as it always does, full of small routines and great absences. But that memory never left me. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. It simply remains, like an internal scar that no one sees. But that still pulsates when the weather changes. We never spoke again. There were no letters, no meetings, no messages left with third parties. The last concrete link that connected us was that look on that last night, and somehow, the letter that never left my hands, but which, mysteriously, fulfilled its destiny. Everything we could have been was suspended in the space between a touch and a kiss that never happened. Sometimes I wonder what would have been like if we had crossed that line. Maybe we would have experienced something intense and brief, crushed by the weight of war. Maybe the memory would have grown bitter over time. Or maybe, and this is what hurts the most to imagine, we would have found a way to survive together. But none of that happened. We remained in the safe, and painful, territory of the unsaid. This empty space, however, was never truly empty. It was filled with glances that carried more than words could contain, with shared silences, with gestures so small they would be invisible to anyone else. War taught us that what is left unsaid sometimes weighs the most. I think of it as a chapter without an ending, but not in the sense of frustration. It's like a page torn from a book you never read to the end. You know it existed. You feel the space it left, but you can't get it back. And perhaps, precisely for that reason, it remains perfect within you, without the wear and tear that reality could impose. People talk a lot about great loves, about stories that cross oceans and defy the impossible. Mine was silent, hidden in the corner of a field hospital, amid bandages and whispered orders. A love that was unspoken, untouched in its entirety, but which, even so, shaped the way I view life and the choices I've made. He taught me something no nursing school or battlefield could teach, that sometimes love is simply recognizing the other, seeing them completely, even if only for a few days, and holding that vision forever. Now, sitting in my quiet living room in Fresno, with the bonsai beside me and the worn tatami mat beneath my feet, I look at the envelope still tucked away and wonder if I should finally destroy it. But I can't. It's more than paper and ink. It's physical proof that, for a brief moment, someone trusted me completely. And even if that trust never turned into a shared life, it was real. I pretended he was just a patient. Maybe that's what everyone saw. But to me, he was everything I could never tell. Sometimes I think war doesn't end when the bombs fall silent. It continues in the small details, in the way we avoid certain glances, in the excessive care with words, in the weight of objects we dare not discard. For me, it remains at the bottom of a drawer, in an envelope I've never opened. Many ask me what the most difficult moment of my service was. They expect me to talk about the most serious injuries, the sleepless nights, or the collective losses. But the hardest moment was losing someone who, officially, was never there. There was no record, there was no farewell, and to the world, none of that happened. I keep this story to myself because I know that, spoken aloud, it would sound like a fabrication. Who would believe in a love that wasn't declared, in a kiss that never happened, in a promise never written? But it is precisely in this absence that it lives. And perhaps that's why I've never tried to fill it, because to fill it would be to erase what it truly is. I know that wherever he is now, or has been, his life has moved on. And somehow, mine has too. We don't share destinies, but we share a moment of truth in the midst of a place made of lies and disguises. And for me, that's enough. Today, when I close my eyes, I can still see him in the dim light of the wing, sitting by the window, with that look that wasn't meant for me, but that, somehow, found me. The war is over, but he remains. Not in portraits, not in archives, not in official histories, but here, where no one can take him from me. And perhaps this is the only possible ending for the two of us, to exist in silence forever. If this story also reminded you of someone you've never been able to forget, share it in the comments. Your memory could be what keeps someone's story alive. And if it touched your heart, like the video so more people can find these hidden memories